In the frozen hills of Larkspur, Colorado, a 7-year-old girl stood alone in the snow, arms wrapped around a trembling Mustang tied to a dying tree. Her voice had been taken, her family shattered, and her only warmth came from the creature her stepmother left to freeze. But what Clara May did next would melt the heart of a town that had long forgotten how to feel. This is a story about quiet courage, a promise from beyond the grave, and the miracle of a girl who saved a wild horse, just as it saved her. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Larkspur, Colorado, was the kind of town where winter didn't arrive. It took hold. Snow didn't simply fall. It settled into the skin of the land like an old regret. The mountains rose to the west, jagged and white, and the wind that slipped through their passes arrived with a bite sharp enough to make you flinch. On the edges of the town, where the pines whispered in the frost and chimneys sent thin trails of smoke into gray skies, the roads narrowed into silence. And at the very end of Timber Ridge Road stood a weather-worn log house that leaned just slightly to the east, as if tired of bracing against the storm. Inside that house, wrapped in a threadbare quilt and sitting on the floor beside a sputtering wood stove, was a little girl named Clara May Whitford. She was 7, with wind-tangled blonde hair and pale, watchful eyes that saw more than she spoke. Clara had the kind of face that didn't ask for attention but held it anyway. Quiet, solemn, like she knew how easily warm things disappeared. She hadn't laughed in months. Not since her father, Glenn Whitford, had died in a fire that swallowed half of Cotton Hollow Ranch. Glenn had been a horse trainer, broad-shouldered, full of stories and unafraid of the wildness in things. He had a voice like gravel and honey, and Clara had loved how he whispered to nervous colts like they were old friends. People in town still spoke his name with a kind of reverence. Died doing what he loved, they'd say. But Clara would have traded every wild Mustang he ever calmed just to hear him whistle again. Her mother, Lauren Whitford, hadn't spoken in months either, not since the accident. The car crash had left her in a coma, curled in a hospital bed 3 counties away. Clara had only seen her once since, and she remembered more the beeping machines than her mother's face. The world had thinned down to snow and silence, and Clara had learned to carry both. Now she lived with Judith Whitford, her stepmother. Judith was a tall, angular woman in her early 40s with auburn hair always pulled into a taut knot at the nape of her neck. She dressed in crisp sweaters, spoke in clipped tones, and moved like she was trying not to disturb the air. Judith wasn't unkind, not exactly. She made sure Clara was fed, clothed, and warm enough. But warmth was something Judith gave to no one, not even herself. She kept the house clean, the radio tuned to classical music, and her distance measured with precision. Judith had once been a veterinarian. People said she used to smile, to hum while she worked, to kneel in the dirt beside sick foals and whisper gentle encouragement. That was before Glenn, before she married him and before he died and left her with the echoes of a life she wasn't prepared to raise. Clara didn't hate her, but she didn't understand her either. Most days passed like ghosts. Clara would trace the frost on the window panes with her finger, or sit on the back porch in her father's old flannel shirt, watching the frozen pasture that once held horses. No hooves broke the snow now. No neighs floated on the wind, just the crackle of ice and the sighing of trees. One morning, long before the sun had managed to push through the clouds, Clara sat at the table stirring oatmeal that had gone cold. Judith stood by the sink, sleeves rolled, eyes distant. "You should eat," Judith said without looking. Clara didn't answer. She had grown used to quiet. It felt safer. The door creaked open suddenly, letting in a slash of white and cold. Judith turned, frowning. A man stood in the doorway, snow clinging to his heavy coat. His face was half hidden behind a scarf, but his eyes were familiar, deep-set, brown and gentle, with a tired kind of kindness. "I knocked," he said, his voice warm despite the chill. "Didn't think anyone heard." Judith moved to block Clara slightly. "Can I help you?" He pulled down his scarf. "Name's Emmett Rowe. I used to work with Glenn, back when he was training Mustangs up in Loveland." Clara's head turned. The name struck something deep. Her father had told her stories about Emmett, the ranger who could read tracks like words, who always brought jerky in his saddlebag, who once fought off a mountain lion with a shovel. "I'm not here to stir anything up," Emmett said softly. "Just came to keep a promise." He opened the back of his truck. Inside stood a young Mustang, no older than 8 months, small but proud, with a coat the color of cinnamon and a white blaze across its nose like a lightning bolt. Its eyes were wide but not wild. "This is Ash," Emmett said. "Your daddy asked me if anything ever happened to him to find Clara the bravest Mustang I could. Said she'd need something strong to lean on." Judith's jaw tightened. "A wild horse? That's not—" "I trained him," Emmett said gently. "He's not wild. Not anymore." Clara stood slowly. The cold had disappeared from her skin. She walked toward the truck without speaking, stopped beside the trailer gate, and reached out. Ash lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he breathed in her scent. When their fingers and fur touched, something melted. Not the snow, not the air, but something in Clara's chest that had frozen too long. "I'll call him Ash," she whispered, "because he feels like fire that isn't gone yet." Judith opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't argue. Not that day. Ash stayed in the shed that night. Clara sat beside him on a hay bale, wrapped in 2 blankets, telling him about stars her dad used to hang in trees and how the world used to be louder. Ash listened like horses do, still, steady, and without judgment. Outside, snow kept falling, but inside the silence something had begun to stir. Not loud, not bright, but alive. The snow that morning was thicker than usual, curling over fence posts and clinging to branches like lace spun from frost. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the sky was already that heavy, metallic gray that made animals restless and people locked their doors a little earlier than normal. In the quiet shed behind the Whitford house, Clara May sat cross-legged on a wool blanket, her breath puffing out in small clouds. Ash, the young Mustang, stood nearby, his cinnamon-colored coat glowing faintly in the muted light streaming through a small window. He had slept curled beside her most of the night, never straying far from her presence. Ash wasn't like the horses Clara had seen in books, tame, stiffly posed with shining manes. He was lean, not quite filled out yet, his legs long and slightly knobby, the way young horses are before they grow into their bones. But there was a quiet strength in the way he moved, a steadiness that made Clara feel safe. His eyes were intelligent, rimmed in thick lashes, and he had the habit of lowering his head just slightly when listening, as though trying to understand not just words, but what lay beneath them. Clara had brought him a bucket of warm mash, stirred with chopped carrots and a bit of honey the way her father used to prepare it. Ash sniffed at the mixture, then ate slowly, his ears flicking occasionally at distant sounds. The creak of the woods, the ticking of snow on the tin roof. Inside the house, Judith moved from room to room with more sharpness than usual. She hadn't said much since Emmett left the night before, only asked if Clara was planning to keep the horse in the living room. Clara hadn't answered. Judith's disapproval was never loud, but it settled into the walls like cold air. Her silences spoke in paragraphs. She was a woman shaped by disappointment. A childhood spent moving town to town, her veterinary career cut short by an accident with a panicked stallion that fractured her wrist permanently. She had never spoken of that day, but Clara had once seen the old brace in the back of the medicine drawer, still stained with dried iodine. Judith walked with a quiet limp in winter, one she tried to hide. That afternoon, the first gusts of wind arrived, rattling the shutters like a warning. Clara had just returned from the shed when a car engine growled up the snowy road. It stopped in front of the house, tires crunching. Clara pulled back the curtain slightly, her breath catching. A dark green pickup sat at the edge of the driveway. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a woman wrapped in a quilted navy coat and wool hat. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with hair the color of dried corn silk peeking from beneath her knit cap. Her face was kind but lined, someone who had smiled and worried in equal measure all her life. Judith opened the front door before the woman knocked. "Beatrice Langley," Judith said flatly. "I figured you'd turn up sooner or later." Beatrice smiled politely. "You know how word travels in this town." Beatrice Langley was the town's unofficial historian and owner of the local art gallery. She painted landscapes mostly, and her home was filled with canvases that smelled of turpentine and pinewood smoke. Beatrice had been friends with Glenn and Lauren once, years before Judith entered the picture. "I heard a Mustang showed up in your shed," Beatrice said, brushing snow from her shoulders as she stepped inside. "That's the sort of thing folks notice around here." Clara stepped forward shyly, her hands curled into her sleeves. Beatrice's gaze softened. "You must be Clara," she said gently. "You've grown since I last saw you. You look just like your mother." Clara nodded. She didn't remember Beatrice well, only vaguely, like a smell from a dream. Beatrice set down a small box she'd brought. Inside was a leather halter, oiled and worn but well kept, and a bundle of dried herbs tied with string. "Thought these might come in handy. For the horse." Judith folded her arms. "We're not keeping the horse." Clara's heart dropped. Beatrice didn't flinch. "That's not what I heard," she said calmly. "I heard Glenn left him for Clara. That sounds like keeping to me." Judith said nothing. The silence that followed was thick enough to bend. That night, the storm finally arrived. It came not with a roar, but with a whisper, a steady fall of snow that muted every sound. Clara sat on the windowsill in her room, Ash's halter clutched in her lap. She'd snuck it upstairs when Judith wasn't looking. Below, the shed was dark, but she could almost feel the warmth of Ash's breath, steady in the shadows. The wind pressed against the glass, but Clara didn't feel afraid. There was something else in the air now, an unspoken promise, as if her father's voice still hung somewhere between the trees and the stars. The storm passed like a slow-moving breath, leaving behind a world softened in white. In Larkspur, everything seemed quieter after snow. The trees stood heavier, bowed under the weight of frozen time, and the roads became narrow lines through a sea of frost. Days blurred into one another in shades of gray and pale blue, and yet for Clara May Whitford, something had changed. Ash had become more than a gift. He was a presence, a rhythm, a heartbeat outside of her own. Clara spent most of her time with him now. Mornings brushing the snow from his coat, afternoons walking him along the fence line of the pasture behind the shed, evenings sitting close as he breathed warm clouds into the winter air. He followed her without halter or lead, keeping close, his hooves crunching softly behind her boots. His trust was instinctual, the kind that couldn't be taught, only earned in silence. He had filled out some in the days since he arrived. The bones of his hips no longer stood out, and his coat, with its reddish sheen and pale blaze, grew denser, richer, like a fire being fed just enough wood to stay alive. Ash didn't neigh much. Instead, he communicated with ears and eyes, a soft nudge of the muzzle, a steady look that held more kindness than most people Clara had known. He was still young, barely 8 months, but there was a steadiness in him, a maturity that reminded Clara of her father. Maybe that's why she spoke to him more than anyone else. Clara didn't speak often to humans, not anymore. Her voice still worked, but she held it tight inside her, like a pearl in a closed shell. She'd learned early that words could be stolen, twisted, or ignored. But Ash listened, like her words were water in a dry world. She told him about Glenn, how he used to whistle in the barn, how he would braid her hair with bits of hay when Lauren wasn't looking, how he once rode a stallion bareback across the frozen lake just to prove it could be done. She told Ash about her mother, about how Lauren had sung lullabies that didn't exist in any book, how she smelled like lavender and bread dough, and how her laugh made even the birds go quiet to listen. She told him about the attic too, about the letter she hadn't found yet, but knew had to be there. Her father had left pieces of himself behind. She could feel them. One afternoon, Clara brought Ash to the edge of the frozen stream at the bottom of the pasture. The current beneath the ice still whispered, but its voice was muffled, like the world was thinking in dreams. She laid a blanket down beside the bare cottonwoods and watched Ash lower himself onto his knees before settling in with a heavy sigh. Across the stream, the McCulley's barn roof sagged under snow. No horses lived there anymore. Clara remembered when they did, when she'd been small enough to be lifted onto their pony, Pockets, who used to nibble her mitten fingers. The McCulleys had left after their youngest son joined the Navy, and the eldest lost the family's savings in a risky cattle venture. The barn had been empty ever since, but Clara still waved toward it, a silent hello to old memories. Judith noticed the change, of course. Her silences had sharpened. She watched Clara through the kitchen window more often now, arms folded across her chest, lips pursed like she was tasting something bitter. Once, Clara overheard her on the phone. "She's turning inward again," Judith said. "But she's not crying, just floating. Like nothing gets through unless it has 4 legs and fur." Still, Judith didn't stop her. Perhaps some part of her knew that Clara needed something unspoken, or maybe she simply didn't have the energy to fight the ghost of Glenn's wishes. One evening, Beatrice Langley came by again, this time bringing a saddle blanket she'd sewn herself, stitched with a pattern of pine trees and small stars. Beatrice had always been crafty, her fingers permanently marked with specks of paint or threads of wool. She wore a coat the color of moss and boots with rabbit fur cuffs. Her long scarf trailed behind her like a flag of patience. "Judith," she said politely, brushing snow off her shoulders as she entered. "I thought Ash could use something warmer. It's going to dip below 0 tonight." Judith offered a terse nod and stepped aside. Beatrice didn't press. She found Clara out by the shed and handed her the blanket, running a gentle hand along Ash's flank. "He's a beauty," Beatrice murmured. "But more than that, he's a bridge between what was and what might be." Clara didn't say anything, but she gave Beatrice a small smile, the kind that lived in corners. Later that night, after Judith had gone to bed, Clara lit a small oil lamp and tiptoed into the shed. She wrapped the saddle blanket around Ash, then sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. The wind howled faintly beyond the boards, but inside, the world was warm, filled with breath and hay and something deeper, hope, maybe. Or the memory of it. She whispered, "You're not just a horse, you're a piece of him." And Ash, with his great dark eyes, blinked slowly, leaned his head against her shoulder, and stayed. Snow had blanketed Larkspur all day, falling thick and slow like a hush over the whole town. By late afternoon, even the roads were indistinguishable from the fields, and every tree stood cloaked in silence. The wind sharpened, slipping between the eaves of the Whitford house and rattling the loose pane in Clara's bedroom window. The world outside had turned to white, but inside, tension curled like smoke. Judith was already pacing when Clara came in from the shed. Snow clung to her boots, dampened her sleeves. Her cheeks were flushed, and a few strands of hair stuck to her forehead, wind-swept and wild. She'd been brushing Ash, whispering to him the way she always did, sharing secrets meant for no one else. Judith turned sharply. "He was in the doorway," she said, voice clipped. "I saw his prints on the threshold." Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came. "You're letting him wander too close," Judith continued, walking toward the fireplace and grabbing the old wool throw that hung there. "That shed isn't enough, is it? You want to bring him inside next? Let him sit on the couch? Sleep at the foot of your bed?" Clara stared at the rug, her fingers tightening. Judith tossed the blanket at her. "That's for him. Tonight, he sleeps out there, and you don't go back after dark. I don't care how much you cry. It's just a horse." Then she turned her back, walking to the stove to stir the evening stew as if the conversation had ended. Clara stood for a moment, unmoving. Then, cradling the blanket in her arms, she walked outside without a word. The cold swallowed her instantly, but she didn't flinch. Her boots crunched over the hardened snow until she reached the shed. Inside, Ash raised his head, ears pricked forward. He was curled near the far wall, where Clara had stacked hay for warmth. His breath steamed the air. She draped the blanket over his back, brushing his coat smooth with slow, steady strokes. Her father used to say that silence was a kind of kindness if you listened hard enough. Clara sat down beside Ash, cross-legged, and leaned her head against his shoulder. Judith had never liked animals in the house. Even before Glenn died, she'd insisted on boundaries. But Glenn had made exceptions, for sick kittens, for half-frozen strays, for the occasional lamb born early in winter. He would have made an exception now. Clara was sure of it. That night, Clara waited until Judith had gone to sleep. She crept out of bed, wrapped herself in the baby quilt her mother had sewn when she was born, faded yellow with sun-stitched stars, and padded barefoot to the back door. The wind clawed at the walls, but she didn't hesitate. She crossed the yard quickly, opened the shed, and slipped inside. Ash whickered softly. Clara didn't speak. She simply curled beside him on the hay, pulled the quilt around them both, and rested her cheek against his neck. His body was warm and steady. The cold seemed less sharp near him. "I'm not leaving you alone," she whispered. "Not ever." They stayed like that for hours, child and horse, breath rising in tandem, heartbeat to heartbeat. Outside, the wind howled across the empty pasture, but inside, time stopped. Meanwhile, across town, a figure parked outside the local diner. Lucas Harper, a lean man in his mid-30s with a face both worn and handsome, sat inside his pickup truck, rubbing his palms together. Lucas was Glenn Whitford's cousin, though he hadn't seen Clara since the funeral. He wore a leather jacket lined with shearling and jeans faded at the knees. A scar ran from his jaw to his collarbone, an old rodeo injury he never talked about. He'd once been a bronc rider, but a fall off a buckskin stallion had ended that life. Now he worked as a wrangler at a nearby rescue stable. Inside the diner, Martha Jensen, a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes and a bun always slipping down her neck, leaned over his table. "You sure you want to drive back tonight? Roads are looking ugly." Lucas nodded. "I've got someone to check on." Martha frowned. "Judith's girl?" He sipped his coffee. "She's not just Judith's." Martha didn't press. She'd known Glenn too, had seen what grief had done to that house. She brought Lucas a thermos of soup and wished him safe driving. Back at the Whitford house, Judith awoke around midnight to silence that felt wrong. She padded downstairs, flicked on the porch light, and squinted through the frost-rimmed glass. The shed door was cracked open. Grabbing her coat, she stepped outside. Snow crunched under her slippers, and a sharp gust nearly took her breath. She reached the shed and opened it slowly. Inside, the lamp was still glowing faintly. Clara was curled in the hay, arms around Ash, quilt wrapped over them both. Judith didn't speak. She watched the two shapes breathe and sink, the heat of their bodies rising in soft clouds. She stood there for a long time, the cold creeping into her bones. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back into the house. The sun rose slow and heavy, a weak smear of pale light struggling through the slate-colored sky. Larkspur had frozen overnight. The trees outside the Whitford house crackled with ice. Fences gleamed like they'd been dipped in glass. A silence hung over the land, too still to be peaceful, too sharp to ignore. It was the kind of morning where even the birds stayed hidden, and the breath of every living creature felt fragile. Inside the kitchen, Judith stood at the sink, staring down at the wooden floor. The faint outline of a hoofprint had melted into the rug, a single, unmistakable mark from a cloven hoof still damp with melted frost. Her jaw tightened. "Clara!" she called, voice slicing through the quiet like a whip. Clara emerged from the hallway, her cardigan buttoned wrong, hair unbrushed. She froze when she saw what Judith was staring at. Judith didn't raise her voice. That made it worse. "He was inside again?" Clara said nothing, eyes fixed on the floor. "I told you the shed was the line. I told you clearly." Still, Clara remained silent, her hands clenched at her sides. Judith exhaled through her nose, slowly, like someone preparing for a decision they didn't want to make but had already settled on. "Put on your coat," she said, walking toward the door. "Now." Outside, the cold was worse than the night before. It wasn't just wind and ice. It was a kind of emptiness in the air, as if the world had forgotten how to breathe. Clara trailed behind her stepmother, without asking where they were going. Her boots crunched through the snow, thin gloves doing little to stop the sting. Ash stood inside the shed, his ears flicking as they approached. He stepped forward when he saw Clara, his breath forming clouds. Judith entered first and grabbed the lead rope that hung on the wall. Clara's stomach dropped. "No," she said, the word barely louder than the wind. Judith didn't reply. She fastened the rope around Ash's halter and led him out into the snow, walking with determination toward the back of the property. The land stretched flat there, wind-swept and open. A single cottonwood tree, old, gnarled, and half-split by lightning years before, stood near the property line. Its bark had peeled in places, revealing pale scars beneath. Judith tied the lead rope to the lowest branch. "He'll survive the day," she said briskly. "You've coddled him too much." Clara stood behind her. "Shake him. Please." Judith didn't look at her. "It's a horse, Clara, not a child. You're forgetting the difference." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Clara and Ash beneath the brittle arms of the tree. Clara fell to her knees, ignoring the snow soaking into her jeans. Her fingers clawed at the knot Judith had tied, but it was too tight, her gloves too clumsy. She pulled them off, wincing as the cold bit into her skin. Ash lowered his head, nuzzling her shoulder softly. His body trembled. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "I'm trying." The knot wouldn't budge. She did the only thing left. She wrapped her arms around Ash's neck and leaned into him, shielding as much of him as her small frame allowed. The snow had begun to fall again, fine as dust, dancing between their eyelashes. From across the street, a curtain stirred in the window of the blue house with the red shutters. Inside stood Riley Kendall, a woman in her early 40s with a gentle face and a quiet presence. She was tall, with thick brown hair often tied in a loose braid down her back, and she wore reading glasses that always sat too low on her nose. Riley was a writer and editor, mostly from home, and had lived in Larkspur for nearly a decade. She'd moved there after her sister's death, needing stillness after too much noise. Since then, she'd kept to herself, polite, kind, and distant. But when she saw the shape beneath the tree, something shifted in her chest. She squinted, stepped closer, and gasped. Riley didn't even bother with boots. She yanked on her coat, grabbed a scarf, and rushed barefoot onto the porch, jamming her feet into the nearest shoes. By the time she crossed the street, Clara was motionless, her back curved around Ash's neck, her quilt sagging under the weight of snow. The horse didn't move. His legs trembled, but he stood. "Clara?" Riley said gently. The girl didn't stir. Riley knelt, brushing the snow away. Clara's cheeks were flushed but too still. She wasn't shivering. That terrified Riley most. She peeled the quilt back and gathered Clara into her arms. Clara was light, frighteningly so. Riley didn't waste a second. She wrapped her scarf around the child and coaxed Ash toward the house, whispering soothing words she hadn't used in years. Ash followed. Inside the warmth of the blue house, Riley set Clara on the couch and wrapped her in every blanket she could find. She placed a heating pad beneath her feet, boiled water, and made a call. Within minutes, Delilah Mercer arrived. A retired nurse with steel-gray hair always pulled into a low bun, Delilah was the town's unofficial healer. She was short, brisk, and sharp-eyed, with a voice that could calm the most anxious heart. She lived 2 houses down and had been the one to deliver half the babies on Timber Ridge before the hospital opened. "She's hypothermic," Delilah said, checking Clara's pulse, "but not too far gone. We caught it in time." Ash, meanwhile, stood near the fireplace, sides heaving gently, eyes half-lidded but alert. Riley knelt beside him and stroked his shoulder. "You're a good boy," she whispered. The snow outside thickened, but inside, breath and warmth returned. Snow still curled lazily from the sky like sifted flour when Clara opened her eyes. The light above her wasn't the cold white glow of Judith's ceiling, nor the dim flicker of the shed lamp. This light was warm, diffused through sheer curtains drawn halfway across a wide bay window. A fire crackled quietly nearby. The couch beneath her was soft, worn at the edges, and smelled faintly of pine and lavender. Her fingers flexed under a heavy woolen blanket, and her legs were cocooned in flannel. Across the room, beside the hearth, Ash lay curled in a thick nest of towels and fleece. His eyes were half-lidded, his breathing shallow but steady, and the tip of one ear twitched at the sound of her stirring. A figure moved in from the kitchen, carrying a steaming mug. "You're awake," said Riley Kendall, her voice gentle but edged with relief. She wore a thick cardigan, patterned with foxes, and her hair was tied back in a loose braid streaked with gray. Her glasses were perched on her nose, slightly crooked. Clara blinked. "Ash? He's okay," Riley said quickly, kneeling beside her. "You both are. You were lucky. I found you just in time." Clara sat up slowly, swaying for a moment. Her cheeks still stung from the cold and her throat felt dry. Riley offered the mug. "Warm cider. Go slow." Clara sipped. Sweetness and heat slid down her throat like sunlight returning to her ribs. She looked around. This wasn't Beatrice Langley's home. This was somewhere new, yet somehow familiar. "I'm Riley," the woman said, reading the confusion in Clara's eyes. "I live across the street, the blue house with the red shutters." Clara nodded slowly. "You've probably seen me around. I walk every morning at 7 unless it's a blizzard, and I wave, even if people don't wave back." Clara smiled faintly. "I've seen you." "Well, I saw you too. Curled under a cottonwood tree with a horse twice your size. Gave me the fright of my life." Riley's voice was light, but her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the blanket around Clara's legs again. Across the room, the door creaked open and Delilah Mercer entered, carrying a bag of supplies. She wore a long wool coat, patched at the elbow, and a hat with a pom-pom that sagged to one side. The retired nurse was small and wiry, with movements that wasted nothing. "Still warm?" she asked, coming over to check Clara's pulse with her thin fingers. "Color's back in your cheeks, that's something." "She was trying to shield the horse," Riley said softly. Her arms were around its neck like a mother bird. Delilah grunted. "Brave's one thing, foolish is another, but Lord help me, I'd have done the same." Ash let out a low sound, half sigh, half huff. Delilah moved to him, ran a hand along his flank. "He's strong," she said, "but he's spent. Keep the fire steady tonight. Let him rest." As Delilah packed up, Riley turned back to Clara. "You'll stay here tonight, longer if needed. Judith hasn't come asking, and frankly, I'm not expecting her to." Clara nodded, then hesitated. "She's not bad. Just closed." Riley tilted her head. "Closed?" Clara searched for words. "Like a barn door that only opens one way." Riley laughed softly. "Fair enough." That evening, Riley showed Clara the upstairs room. It was simple, with a window that looked out over the snow-covered backyard and a bookshelf lined with novels and a few ceramic horses. Clara ran her fingers across their curved backs, then turned to the small bed in the corner. "There's fresh pajamas on the chair," Riley said. "You settle in. I'll be just down the hall." Clara changed slowly, savoring the warmth of the fleece. She curled into bed, pulling the quilt over her head. She wasn't used to quiet that felt kind. Downstairs, Riley opened a laptop and began typing. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then moved. "Child found curled around Mustang in sub-zero storm, rescued by kindness, held by courage." She paused, then changed the title, "The Girl Who Carried Fire in a Storm." Across the road, Judith stood in the darkened hallway of her home, staring at the back door. The rope still hung limply from the branch. No Clara, no horse, no noise. She turned off the porch light and walked into the kitchen, each step echoing a little too loud. The silence wasn't peace, it was absence. By the end of the week, the storm had finally broken. The snow still lay heavy across the fields and rooftops of Larkspur, but now sunlight had begun to reach the earth again, melting small pockets along the sidewalks and dripping steadily from eaves. Clara May Whitford sat at the kitchen table of Riley Kendall's house, a steaming cup of chamomile cradled in her hands. The smell of baked apples lingered in the air. Ash rested quietly by the back window, his head turned toward the yard, where a patch of grass had peeked through the frost. Clara's cheeks were no longer pale. There was a rosiness returning, slow and gentle, and her voice, quiet, hesitant, had begun to emerge like thawing earth beneath ice. Each word she spoke was like a stone laid on a path she hadn't walked in months. Across from her sat Beatrice Langley, the landscape painter with honey-colored hair, streaked with white and fingers always smudged with oil pastels. Today she wore a blue wool coat and a pin shaped like a snowflake on her scarf. Beatrice had been stopping by more frequently since Clara moved in with Riley, sometimes bringing sketchbooks, sometimes just company. She had a way of listening that made silence feel less lonely. "Do you remember what you were looking for?" Beatrice asked softly, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. Clara nodded. "There's a box," she said, "in the attic. Daddy kept it there. I think he left something." Riley, who was rearranging the logs in the fireplace, looked over. "Your old house?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Judith's place, upstairs, in the little space above the closet." Delilah Mercer had agreed to go with her. The retired nurse, sturdy and brimming with purpose, arrived that afternoon in her signature parka, a faded army green jacket adorned with a silver safety whistle and a row of antique buttons down one sleeve. "I've climbed plenty of attics in my day," Delilah said with a grin. "Just give me a flashlight and a reason." The three of them, Clara, Beatrice, and Delilah, walked across the street to the house Clara used to call home. Judith hadn't been seen much in the past few days. The porch light was off. A single tire track curved out of the driveway, half filled with snow. The door creaked open when Delilah knocked. No answer. They stepped inside cautiously. The warmth of Riley's home felt a world away. Here, the air was still, chilled, the radiators clicking like distant echoes. Clara led them through the narrow hallway, past the kitchen, where dried flowers drooped in a vase, and up the staircase she used to sneak down in the early morning to surprise her father with drawings. In the hallway closet, above the coat rack, was a square wooden hatch. Delilah boosted Clara up, then handed her the flashlight. Clara's small hands tugged the hatch open. A ladder unfolded with a wooden groan. The attic was dry and dim, filled with dust motes and boxes that smelled of cedar and old paper. Clara moved slowly, scanning the familiar shadows, and then, in the far corner, she saw it. A small cedar chest with a brass latch, half buried under a folded quilt and a broken lamp. She lifted the lid with trembling hands. Inside were photos of Glenn Whitford, smiling beside horses, holding baby Clara, kissing Lauren on the porch. There were fire department patches, a weathered journal, and tied with green string, a single envelope with her name on it, written in her father's hand. "Clara, when you're ready." She didn't open it right away. She climbed back down, holding the envelope against her chest. Beatrice put an arm around her shoulders. Back at Riley's, they sat on the couch beside the fire. Ash stood nearby, watching with soft eyes as Clara untied the string and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Glenn's familiar slanted print. "Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I'm not there. But I need you to know I never left you. Not really. I'm with you in every brave thing you do. Some people will pretend to care just to control. Don't trust their voices. Trust your own. It's stronger than you think. Love always, Dad." The paper trembled in Clara's hands. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She read it again, slower, each word a thread stitching her back together. That evening, Beatrice made a call to the County Child Welfare Services. She spoke with a caseworker named Karen Whitmore, a woman in her early 50s with cropped salt and pepper hair and a voice low and even like a lullaby for grown-ups. Karen arrived the next morning, dressed in a navy coat and carrying a worn leather folder under one arm. Riley brewed tea, and Clara sat at the kitchen table. Ash curled beneath her feet. Karen smiled softly. "I'm here to help," she said, "but only if you're ready." Clara reached into her pocket and placed the letter on the table. Karen read it silently, nodding slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "Did she hurt you?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "Not with hands, but she took things, my voice, my safe place. Ash." Karen folded the letter carefully and looked at Clara for a long moment. "And now, I have them back." Outside, the sky was pale, touched with sunlight for the first time in days. Birds had returned to the trees, their songs hesitant but brave. Clara stood by the window that evening, her fingers brushing the glass. Ash stood beside her, his muzzle warm against her arm, and for the first time in a long while she whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." Spring did not burst into Larkspur, it crept in gently, in thawing puddles and softened soil, in bird calls that returned like old songs half remembered. The sky grew lighter each day, no longer the dull steel of winter, but a pale, forgiving blue. Clara May Whitford stood in the backyard of Riley Kendall's house, her breath forming a ghost of warmth in the morning air, even as frost still kissed the edges of the grass. Beside her, Ash nuzzled her arm, his coat now sleek and full, no longer the trembling colt he'd once been. Clara held a small silver bell in her hand, the size of a walnut, its ribbon frayed at the ends. She stepped slowly toward the cottonwood tree that had once been the site of her deepest cold. Now its bark felt warmer somehow, despite the lingering chill. She tied the bell to the lowest branch, just within Ash's reach. It caught the breeze and sang, a clear, delicate sound, like the voice of someone who had finally remembered how to speak. "This is for you," she whispered, "for staying." Behind her, Beatrice Langley stood with her gloved hands folded, eyes misted. Her coat, deep burgundy, fluttered slightly in the breeze. The last few weeks had been a flurry of paperwork, phone calls, and court visits, all leading to one result. Clara was now officially in Beatrice's temporary custody, living in the painter's cottage until further decisions were made. The court had called it a kinship placement, but to Clara, it felt like something deeper, something earned, not given. Ash had settled quickly into his new routine. He now stayed in Beatrice's stable, a sturdy timber structure that had once housed a mule and 2 donkeys during Beatrice's youth. The painter had taken to brushing Ash in the early mornings, often pausing to sketch him with charcoal between strokes. "There's something in his stance," she'd said once. "Like he's still listening to some distant thunder." Riley visited most afternoons, usually bringing muffins or books. She'd taken a special interest in Clara's writing, encouraging her to keep a journal. "Your story matters," she told her, "especially when told in your own words." Clara's entries were short, sometimes only a sentence or two, but they were steady. and that mattered more. At the hospital in Boulder, another kind of thaw had begun. Lauren Whitford, Clara's mother, had begun to show faint but undeniable signs of returning awareness. It had started with a twitch of the fingers, then a shift in breath, then, days later, a flutter of eyelids that lingered. The doctors were cautious, as they always were, but hopeful. "There's something there," they said. "She's not lost." Beatrice and Clara visited twice a week. The drive was long, winding through pine-covered hills and empty valleys, but Clara didn't mind. She brought a paper crane each time, folding them for magazine pages or old maps, and placed them by the bedside. "I told her about Ash," she said once softly. "I told her how he found me." In town, word of what had happened spread like snowmelt. Quiet, persistent. Some gossiped, others sent casseroles. Judith Whitford had not returned. Her sister, a stern woman named Eleanor Mayfield, had come to clear the house. Eleanor, in her late 50s, wore a dark wool coat and gloves that squeaked when she moved boxes. She spoke to no one except briefly to Beatrice to sign a release form. "She won't fight the court," Eleanor had said simply. "She knows." Karen Whitmore, the caseworker, had followed up with her final report that week. She sat with Clara in Beatrice's sunlit kitchen, reading the documents aloud in a soft, deliberate tone. "Your mother's guardianship will remain pending until recovery is confirmed," she said. "In the meantime, Beatrice is your legal guardian. You are safe. You are home." Clara didn't cry. But when Karen stood to leave, Clara surprised her with a hug that lingered just a moment longer than expected. That night, Clara helped Beatrice hang paper stars on the pine tree in the backyard, an old tradition her father had begun when she was small. They were cut from silver foil and notebook pages, uneven and wind-blown, but they sparkled just the same. Ash watched them from the pasture fence, the breeze teasing his mane. "You know," Beatrice said, adjusting one of the strings, "when I was your age, I thought stars granted wishes. Then I grew up and thought they didn't. Now I think, maybe they still do, but only for those who know what to wish for." Clara looked up. "I wished for a voice." "And you got one," she nodded. "But I also got him." Beatrice smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind Clara's ear. "Sometimes the best voices walk on four legs." Later, as twilight stretched over the fields, Clara and Ash stood by the cottonwood tree one last time. The bell chimed faintly, echoing across the quiet land. The snow beneath their feet was melting, and beneath that, the first green blades of spring reached toward the open sky. Sometimes the smallest acts of quiet courage, like holding on to hope or speaking when your voice has long been silenced, can light the way through the coldest seasons of life. Clara didn't shout or fight. She listened, she loved, and she stayed. And in doing so, she found her voice again, not in anger, but in truth, in love, and in the steady breath of a Mustang who simply refused to leave. In our own lives, it's easy to forget that healing doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, in kindness returned, and in the choice to keep going, even when no one's watching. If this story touched something in your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little light today. Don't forget to comment your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter.